It is always wonderful timing that my brother begins his shower the second I sit down to read my history chapter. So, we'll just have to put up with it. It'll only be maybe 10 or 15 minutes. But, I'm going to try to read all of chapter 36. And if I die, then I die. All right. Hopefully, the shower isn't too loud. I don't even know if you guys can hear it. I've never listened to me, recording with shower in it. Let me do this too. I skimmed this, and it seems like a monster of a chapter. I'm a little bit afraid. But you never know. Let's give it a shot. Chapter 36, The American Zenith, on page 850. Unmatched in power or plenty, the United States destroyed the world like a colossus as the 1950s began to unfold. Broadly shared prosperity fueled confidence in the country's capacity to tackle major problems at home and abroad, but problems abounded nonetheless. Americans at mid-century were dug into the front lines of the global Cold War while bitterly divided at home over the explosive issues of communist subversion and civil rights, affluence, and its anxieties. The continuing post-World War II economic boom brought wondrous changes in American society in the 1950s. Prosperity triggered a fabulous surge in home construction as a nation of renters became a nation of homeowners. One of every 4 homes standing in America in 1960 had been built during the 1950s, and 83% of those new homes were in suburbia. In a period marked by massive military spending and public investment in research, science, and technology drove economic growth more than ever. The invention of the transistor in 1948 sparked a revolution in electronics and especially in computers. The first electronic computers assembled in the 1940s were massive machines with hundreds of miles of wiring and thousands of nickel cathode ray tubes. Transistors and later printed circuits on silicon wafers made possible dramatic miniaturization and phenomenal computational speed. Computer giant International Business Machines, IBM, became the prototype of the high-tech corporation in the dawning information age. Computers transformed age-old business practices like billing and inventory control and opened new frontiers in areas like airline scheduling, high-speed printing, and telecommunications. Aerospace industries also grew fantastically in the 1950s, thanks both to the government's buildup of Strategic Air Command, SAC, and to a robustly expanding passenger airline business, as well as to connections between military and civilian aircraft production. In 1957, the Seattle-based Boeing company brought out the first large passenger jet, the 707, whose design owed much to the previous development of SAC's long-range strategic bomber, the B-52. The nature of the workforce was also changing. A crucial shift was marked in 1956 when white-collar workers for the first time outnumbered blue-collar workers, signaling the passage from an industrial to a post-industrial or service-based economy. Keeping pace with that fundamental transformation, organized labor slowly withered along with the smokestack industries that had been its sustenance. Union membership as a percentage of the labor force peaked at about 35% in 1954 and then went into steady decline. The surge in white-collar employment opened special opportunities for women. When World War II ended, many women, including those who had worked in war plants, returned to highly conventional roles as mothers and homemakers. A cult of domesticity emerged in popular cultures to celebrate those eternal feminine functions. When 1950s television programs like Ozzie and Harriet or Leave It to Beaver depicted idyllic suburban families with a working husband, 2 children, and a homebound wife, they did so without irony. Much of the middle-class America really did live that way. But as the 1950s progressed, a quiet revolution was gaining momentum that was destined to transform women's roles and even the character of the American family. Of some 40 million new jobs created in the 3 decades after 1950, more than 30 million were in clerical and service work. Women filled the huge majority of these new positions. They were the principal employment beneficiaries of the post-war era, creating an extensive pink-collar ghetto of occupations that came to be dominated by women. Exploiting employment opportunities for women in the 1950s unleashed a groundswell of social and psychological shocks that mounted to a tidal wave proportions in the decades that followed. From one perspective, women's surge into the workplace was nothing new, only a return to the days when the United States was an agricultural nation, and men and women alike toiled on the family farm. But the urban age was not the agricultural age, and women's new dual role as both worker and homemaker raised urgent questions about family life and traditional definitions of gender differences. Feminist Betty Friedan gave focus and fuel to the women's feelings in 1963 when she published The Feminine Mystique, a runaway bestseller and a classic feminist protest literature that launched the modern women's movement. Friedan spoke in rousing accents to millions of able, educated women who applauded her indictment of the stifling boredom of suburban housewifery. Consumer culture in the 50s. The 1950s witnessed a huge expansion of the middle class and the blossoming of a consumer culture that defined a distinctive lifestyle. Diners Club introduced the plastic credit card in 1949, just 1 year after the first fast food-style McDonald's hamburger stand opened in Just 1 year after, the first fast food-style McDonald's hamburger stand opened in South Bernardino, California. In 1955, Disneyland opened its doors in Anaheim, California. Easy credit, high-volume fast food production, and new forms of leisure marked an emerging culture of consumption that soon moved beyond America's borders. Crucial to the development of consumerism was the rapid rise of new technology of television. Only 6 TV stations were broadcasting in 1946. A decade later, 442 stations were operating. TV sets were rich people's novelties in the 1940s, but 7 million sets were sold in 1951. By 1960, virtually every American home had one, in stunning display of the speed with which new technologies can pervade. Wait, hold on. Sorry, I had to move my microphone. Virtually every American home had one, in a stunning display of the speed with which new technologies can pervade and transform modern societies. Attendance at movies sank as the entertainment industry changed its focus from the silver screen to the picture tube. By the mid-1950s, advertisers annually spent $10 billion to hawk their wares on television, while critics fumed that the wildly popular new mass medium was degrading the public's aesthetic, social, moral, political, and educational standards. To the question, why is television called a medium? Pundits replied, because it's never rare or well done. Even religion capitalized on the powerful new electronic pulpit. Celebrity preachers and priests like the Baptist Billy Graham, the Pentecostal holiness preacher Oral Roberts, and the Roman Catholic Fulton J. Sheen took to the airwaves to spread the Christian gospel. Television also catalyzed the commercialization of professional sports, as viewing audiences that once outnumbered in the stadium capacity thousands could now be counted in the couch potato millions. Sports also reflected the shift in population towards the west and south. In 1958, baseball's New York Giants moved to San Francisco, and the Brooklyn Dodgers abandoned Flatbush for Los Angeles. Those moves touched off a new westward and southward movement of sports franchises. Shifting population and spreading affluence led eventually to substantial expansion of the major baseball leagues and the principal football and basketball leagues as well. Popular music was dramatically transformed in the 50s. The chief revolutionary was Elvis Presley, a white singer born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi. Fusing black rhythm and blues with white bluegrass and country styles, Elvis helped to create a new musical idiom known forever as rock and roll. Rock was crossover music, carrying its heavy beat and driving rhythms across the cultural divide that separated black and white musical traditions. Listening and dancing to rock and roll became a rite of passage for millions of young people around the world, from Japan to working-class Liverpool, England, where Elvis's music inspired teenagers John Lennon and Paul McCartney to form a band that would become the Beatles. Traditionalists were repelled by Presley and much else in the affluent 50s. Movie star Marilyn Monroe, with her ingenious smile and dangerous curves, helped to popularize and commercialize new standards of sensuous sexuality. So did Playboy magazine, whose first issue Monroe graced in 1953. As the decade closed, Americans were well on their way to becoming free-spending consumers of mass-produced, standardized products, which were advertised on the electronic medium of television and often sold for their alleged sexual allure. Many critics lamented the implications of this new consumerist lifestyle. Harvard sociologist David Reisman portrayed post-war generation as a pack of conformists in The Lonely Crowd, as did William H. White Jr. in The Organization Man, and novelist Sloane Wilson in The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith bemoaned the spectacle of private opulence amidst public squalor in a series of books beginning with The Affluent Society, but Galbraith's call to invest in the public good fell on mostly deaf ears in the giddily affluent 50s. The advent of Eisenhower. Democratic prospects in the presidential election of 1952 were blinded by military deadlock in Korea, Truman's clash with MacArthur, and war-bred inflation. Dispirited Democrats nominated a reluctant Adlai E. Stevenson, the eloquent and idealistic governor of Illinois. Republicans enthusiastically chose war hero General Dwight D. Eisenhower on the first ballot. Ike's running mate was California Senator Richard M. Nixon, who had gained notoriety as a relentless red hunter. Eisenhower was already the most popular American of his time, and "I like Ike" buttons everywhere testified. Striking grandfatherly, non-partisan pose, Eisenhower left the rough campaigning to Nixon, who relished bare-knuckle political combat. The vice presidential candidate lambasted his opponents with charges that they had cultivated corruption, carved in on Korea, and coddled communists. He particularly blasted with cerebral Stevenson as Adlai the Appeaser, with a Ph.D. from Secretary of State Dean Acherson's College of Cowardly Communist Containment. Nixon himself faltered late in the campaign amid accusations that he had accepted illegal donations. Responding with a self-pitying live address on television, Nixon denied the charges and solemnly declared that the only campaign gift he had ever received was the family cocker spaniel, Checkers. The shameless and mawkish Checkers speech saved Nixon's spot on the ticket and spotlighted a fundamental change in American politics. Television was now a formidable political tool that, much more than radio, allowed candidates to bypass traditional party machinery and speak directly to voters. A future awaited, one critic observed, of selling the president like toothpaste. The outcome of the presidential election of 1952 was never really in doubt. Given an extra prod by Eisenhower's last-minute pledge to go personally to Korea to end the war, the voters overwhelmingly declared for Ike. He garnered 32 million votes to Stevenson's 27 million, ringing up 442 electoral votes to 89 for his opponents. Ike also managed to pull enough Republican legislators into office on his military coattails to gain GOP control of the new Congress by a hair's breadth. True to his campaign pledge, President-elect Eisenhower flew to Korea for 3 days in December 1952. 7 bloody months later, an armistice was finally signed. The brutal and futile fighting had lasted 3 years. More than 30,000 Americans lay dead, joined by perhaps more than 1 million Chinese, North Koreans, and South Koreans. Tens of billions of American dollars had been poured down the Asian sinkhole. Yet this terrible toll in blood and treasure brought only a return to the condition of 1950. Korea remained divided at the 38th parallel, while the broader Cold War remained frigidly frozen. Both in the military and the civilian realms, Eisenhower had long cultivated a leadership style that self-consciously projected an image of sincerity, fairness, and optimism. In the White House, he now struck the pose of unpolitical president, serenely above the petty partisan fray. He surely knew that his greatest asset was his enjoyment of the affection and respect of our citizenry, as he confided to his diary in 1949. Ike thus seemed ideally suited to soothe the anxieties of Americans who yearned for a period of calm in which they could pursue their new ambitions for consumerist affluence. Ably playing this reassuring role, he presided over a decade of shaky peace and shining prosperity. Yet critics charged that he unwisely hoarded the asset of his immense popularity rather than spend it for a good cause, especially civil rights. And his initial failure to stand up to the McCarthyist demagoguery bubbling up from his own party showed either timidity or opportunism. Desegregating American society. America counted some 15 million black citizens in 1950, 2/3 of whom still made their homes in the South, where they lived bound by the iron folkways of segregated society. A rigid set of antiquated rules known as Jim Crow laws covered all aspects of their existence, from the schoolroom to the restroom. Every day of their lives, Southern blacks dealt with a bizarre array of separate social arrangements that kept them insulated from whites, economically inferior and politically powerless. Blacks in the South not only attended segregated schools, but were compelled to use separate public toilets, drinking fountains, restaurants, and waiting rooms. Trains and buses had whites only and colored-only seating. Only about 20% of eligible Southern blacks were registered to vote, and fewer than 5% were registered in some deep South states like Mississippi and Alabama. Where the law proved insufficient to enforce this regime, vigilante violence did the job. 6 Black War veterans, claiming the rights for which they had fought overseas, were murdered in the summer of 1946. A Mississippi mob lynched black 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955 for allegedly leering at a white woman. It is small wonder that a black clergyman declared that everywhere I go in the South, the Negro is forced to choose between his hide and his soul. Segregation tarnished America's international image much as McCarthyism did. And after the war, African-American entertainers like Paul Robeson and Josephine Baker toured widely in Europe and Latin America, informing audiences about the horrors of Jim Crow and raising doubts about America's reputation as the beacon of freedom against Soviet communism. Intellectuals poured on criticism as well. Swedish scholar Gunnar Myrdal published his landmark book, An American Dilemma, exposing the scandalous contradiction between the liberty-loving American creed and the nation's shameful treatment of black citizens. International pressure combined with grassroots legal activism to propel some racial progress in the North during and after World War II. In a growing number of northern cities and states, African Americans battled for, and won, equal access to public accommodations like restaurants, hotels, theaters, and beaches. Jackie Robinson cracked baseball's color barrier when the Brooklyn Dodgers signed him in 1947. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, pushed the Supreme Court in 1950 to rule in Sweatt v. Painter that separate professional schools for blacks failed to meet the test of equality. The repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943, the Supreme Court's ban in 1948 on court enforcement of racially restrictive housing covenants, and a string of repeals of state-level miscegenation all signaled the decline of legal discrimination against not only African Americans but other racial and ethnic minorities as well. The South saw little of that progress in the early post-war years, but increasingly African Americans refused to suffer in silence. On a chilly day in December 1955, Rosa Parks, a college-educated black seamstress who had long been active in the NAACP, made history in Montgomery, Alabama. She boarded a bus, took a seat in the whites-only section, and refused to give it up. Her arrest for violating the city's Jim Crow statuses sparked a year-long black boycott of city buses and served notice throughout the South that blacks would no longer submit meekly to the absurdities and indignities of segregation. The Montgomery bus boycott also capitulated to prominence a young pastor at Montgomery's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. The 27-year-old seemed an unlikely champion of the downtrodden and disfranchised. Raised in a prosperous black family in Atlanta and educated partly in New York, it says North, and I said New York. North. He had for the most of his life been sheltered from the grossest cruelties of segregation, but his oratorical skill, strategic savvy, mastery of biblical and constitutional conceptions of justice, and devotion to the nonviolent principles of India's Mohandas Gandhi all thrust him to the forefront of the black revolution that soon pulsed across the South and the rest of the nation. I'd take another sip. seeds of the Civil Rights Revolution. When a horrified Harry Truman heard about the lynching of black war... Ooh, my mic fell. When a horrified Harry Truman heard about the lynching of black war veterans in 1946, he responded by commissioning a report titled To Secure These Rights. Following the report's recommendations, Truman in 1948 ended segregation in the federal civil service and the armed forces. Yet the conservative coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats in Congress refused to pass civil rights legislation, and Truman's White House successor, Eisenhower, showed no real interest in racial issues. In the 1950s, it was the Supreme Court that assumed political leadership in the civil rights struggle. Chief Justice Earl Warren, former Republican governor of California, shocked traditionalists with his active judicial intervention in previously taboo social issues. Publicly snubbed and privately scorned by Ike, Warren courageously led the court to address urgent issues that Congress and the president preferred to avoid, prompting Impeach Earl Warren signs to blossom along the nation's highways. The unanimous decision of the Warren Court in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in May 1954 was epical. In a forceful opinion, the justices ruled that segregation in public schools was inherently unequal and thus unconstitutional. The uncompromising decision reversed the court's earlier declaration in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. Desegregation, the justices now insisted, must go ahead with all deliberate speed. The border states generally made reasonable efforts to comply with this ruling, but in the Deep South, diehards organized massive resistance against desegregation. More than 100 Southern congressional representatives and senators signed the Declaration of Constitutional Principles in 1956, pledging their unyielding resistance to desegregation. Several states diverted public funds to hastily created private schools where the integration order was more difficult to apply. Throughout the South, while white citizens' councils, sometimes by the light of burning crosses, thwarted attempts to make integration a reality. 10 years after the court's momentous ruling, fewer than 2% of the eligible blacks in the Deep South were sitting in classrooms with whites. President Eisenhower remained reluctant to promote integration. He shied away from employing his vast popularity and the prestige of his office to educate white Americans about the need for racial justice. His personal attitudes may have helped to restrain him. He had grown up in an all-white town, spent his career in a segregated army, and advised against integration of the armed forces in 1948. He complained that the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education had upset the customs and convictions of at least 2 generations of Americans, and he steadfastly refused to issue a public statement endorsing the court's conclusions. I do not believe, he explained, that prejudices, even palpably unjustifiable prejudices, will succumb to compulsion. But in September 1957, Ike was forced to act. Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, mobilized the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from enrolling in Little Rock Central High School. Confronted with a direct challenge to federal authority, Eisenhower sent troops to escort the children to their classes. In the same year, Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction. Eisenhower characteristically reassured a Southern senator that the legislation represented the mildest civil rights bill possible. It set up a permanent Civil Rights Commission to investigate violations of civil rights and authorized federal injunctions to protect voting rights. Blacks, meanwhile, continued to take the civil rights movement into their own hands. Martin Luther King Jr. formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in 1957. It aimed to mobilize the vast power of black churches on behalf of black rights. This was an exceptionally shrewd strategy because the churches were the largest and best organized black institutions that had been allowed to flourish in a segregated society. More spontaneous was the sit-in movement launched on February 1, 1960 by 4 black college freshmen in Greensboro, North Carolina. Without a detailed plan or institutional support, they demanded service at a whites-only Woolworth's lunch counter. Observing that fellows like you make our race look bad, even the black waitress refused to serve them, but they kept their seats and returned the next day with 19 classmates. The following day, 85 students joined in. By the end of the week, 1,000. The sit-in movement rolled swiftly across the South, swelling into a wave of wait-ins, lions, and pray-ins to compel equal treatment in restaurants, transportation, employment, housing, and voter registration. In April 1960, Southern black students formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, pronounced SNCC, to give more focus and force these efforts. Young and impassioned, SNCC members would eventually lose patience with the more stately tactics of the SCLC and even more deliberate legalisms of the NAACP. Another sip. This is where all the text gets long. That's okay. Eisenhower and Republicanism at home. Eisenhower had entered the White House in 1953, pledging his administration to a philosophy of dynamic conservatism. In all those things which deal with people, be liberal, be human, he advised. But when it came to the people's money or their economy or their form of government, be conservative. This balanced, middle-of-the-road course harmonized with the depression-daunted and war-weary mood of the times. Some critics called Eisenhower's presidency a case of the bland leading of the bland. the bland leading the bland. Importantly, such a cautious approach entailed no ambitious efforts to roll back the major achievements of the New Deal. As he told his brother, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. Ike thus consolidated rather than destroyed the new social contract that had been forged during the Great Depression. Eisenhower nonetheless sought to halt further expansions of government programs. He was determined to balance the federal budget and guard the republic from what he called creeping socialism. The former Supreme Allied commander put the brakes on Truman's enormous military buildup, though defense spending still soaked up 10% of the GNP. Eisenhower won Southern support by endorsing the transfer of control over offshore oil fields from the federal government to the states. He also tried to curb the TVA by encouraging a private power company to compete with the massive public utility. Ike aggressively tackled the issue of illegal Mexican immigration, responding both to domestic pressure and to the Mexican government's worries that border crossings undercut the Bracero program of illegally imported farm workers. In a massive roundup of illegal immigrants dubbed Operation Wetback in reference to the migrants' watery route across the Rio Grande, as many as 1 million Mexicans were apprehended and returned to Mexico in 1954. Meanwhile, in another of the rude and arbitrary reversals that have afflicted the government's relations with Native Americans, Eisenhower sought to cancel the tribal preservation policies of the Indian New Deal in place since 1934. He proposed to terminate the tribes as legal entities and to revert to the assimilationist goals of the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. Most Indians resisted the termination policy, and it was abandoned in 1961. Ike also backed a public works project that dwarfed anything the New Dealers had dreamed of. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorized a $27 billion plan to build 42,000 miles of sleek, fast motorways. The president believed that such roads were essential to national defense, allowing U.S. troops to mobilize anywhere in the country in the event of a Soviet invasion. Beyond being a defense strategy, laying down these modern, multi-lane roads created countless construction jobs and speeded the suburbanization of America. The Highway Act offered juicy benefits to the trucking, automobile, oil, and travel industries, while robbing the railroads, especially passenger trains, of business. The act also exacerbated problems of air quality and energy consumption, and it had disastrous consequences for many cities. Once vibrant downtowns withered away, while shopping malls and other sites of leisure and consumption flourished in the far-flung suburbs. A new look in foreign policy. The 1957 Republican platform called for a new look in foreign policy. It condemned mere containment of communism as negative, futile, and immoral. Incoming Secretary of State John Foster Dulles promised not merely to stem the red tide, but to roll back its gains and liberate captive peoples. At the same time, the new administration promised to balance the budget by cutting military spending. How were these two contradictory goals to be reached? Dulles answered with a policy of boldness in early 1951. Eisenhower would relegate the Army and the Navy to the backseat and build up the Strategic Air Command's air fleet of super bombers equipped with city-flattening nuclear bombs. These fearsome weapons would inflict massive retaliation on the Soviets or Chinese in the event of hostilities. The advantages of this new policy were thought to lie in the power of the nuclear intimidation and its relatively cheap price tag. At the same time, Eisenhower sought a thaw in the Cold War through negotiations with the new Soviet leaders who came to power after Joseph Stalin's death in 1953. Excuse me. In the end, the touted new look proved illusory. A new Soviet premier, the burly Nikita Khrushchev, rudely rejected Ike's call in 1955 for an open skies mutual inspection program over both the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1956, the Hungarians rose up against their Soviet masters and felt badly betrayed when the U.S. turned a deaf ear to their desperate appeals for aid. The brutally crushed Hungarian uprising revealed the sobering truth that America's mighty nuclear sledgehammer was too heavy a weapon to wield in such a relatively minor crisis. The strategic limitations of massive retaliation doctrine were thus starkly exposed. The Vietnam Nightmare. Southeast Asia provided further illustration of those limitations. In Vietnam and elsewhere, nationalist movements had sought for years to throw off the yoke of French colonial rule. The legendary Vietnamese leader, Ngo Ho Chi Minh, had tried to appeal personally to Woodrow Wilson in Paris as early as 1990 to support self-determination for the peoples of Southeast Asia. Franklin Roosevelt had likewise inspired hope among Asian nationalists, but Cold War events dampened the dreams of the anti-colonial Asian peoples. Their leaders, including Ho Chi Minh, became increasingly communist while the United States became increasingly anti-communist. By 1954, American taxpayers were financing nearly 80% of the cost of a bottomless French colonial war in Indochina. The United States share amounted to be about $1 billion a year, given partly as a bid to win French approval of a plan to rearm West Germany. The Germans were duly welcomed into the NATO fold in 1955. Despite this massive aid, French forces continued to crumble under pressure from Ho Chi Minh's nationalist guerrilla forces, called the Viet Minh. In March 1954, a key French garrison was trapped hopelessly in the fortress of Dien Bien Poo. I literally can't read these. In the northwestern, I'm going to butcher all of these words. In the northwestern corner of Vietnam, the new policy of boldness was now put to the test. Secretary Dulles, Vice President Nixon, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff favored the intervention with American bombers to help bail out the beleaguered French, but Eisenhower held back. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu proved a victory for the nationalists, and multinational nation conference in Geneva roughly halved Vietnam in the 17th parallel. The victorious Ho Chi Minh in the north consented to this arrangement on the assurance that Vietnam-wide elections would be held within 2 years. In the south, a pro-Western government under Ngo Diem was soon entrenched at Saigon. Convinced the communists would win, Diem's regime and its American backers refused to hold the promised unification elections. American aid nonetheless continued as communist guerrillas heated up their campaign against Diem. The Americans had eventually backed a losing horse, but could see no easy way to call off their bet. I'm getting sleepy. How much is left? It's awful, but it's not awful, I suppose. Cold War crises in the Middle East. Fears of Soviet penetration into oil-rich Middle East further heightened Cold War tensions. The government of Iran, supposedly influenced by the Kremlin, began to resist the power of the gigantic Western companies that controlled Iranian petroleum. In response, the American Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, helped engineer a coup in 1953 that reinstalled the useful Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as a kind of dictator. Though successful in the short run in securing Iranian oil for the West, the American intervention left a bitter legacy of resentment among many Iranians. More than 2 decades later, they took their revenge on the Shah and his American allies. The Suez Crisis proved far messier than the swift stroke in Iran. President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, an ardent Arab nationalist, was seeking funds to build an immense dam on the Upper Nile for urgently needed irrigation and power. America and Britain tentatively offered financial help, but when Nasser began to flirt openly with the communist camp, Secretary of State Dulles dramatically withdrew the dam offer. Nasser promptly regained force by nationalizing the Suez Canal, owned chiefly by British and French stockholders. Nasser's action placed a razor's edge at the jugular vein of Western Europe's oil supply. America's jittery French and British allies, deliberately keeping Washington in the dark and coordinating their blow with one from Israel, staged a joint assault on Egypt late in October 1956. The invaders calculated that the United States would supply them with oil while their Middle Eastern supplies were disrupted. But their unpleasant surprise, a furious President Eisenhower resolved to let them boil in their own oil and refused to release emergency supplies. The Oilist allies resentfully withdrew their troops, and for the first time in history, a UN police force was sent to maintain order. The Suez Crisis marked the last time that the U.S. could brandish its oil weapon. As recently as 1940, the United States had produced 2/3 of the world's oil, while a scant 5% of the global supply flowed from the Middle East. But by 1948, the U.S. had become a net oil importer, and the economic and strategic importance of the Middle East oil region began to grow dramatically. The region's poor, sandy sheikdoms increasingly resolved to reap for themselves the lion's share of the enormous oil wealth that the Western companies pumped out of the scorching deserts. In a portentous move, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran joined with Venezuela in 1960 to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. In the next 2 decades, OPEC further tightened its stranglehold on the Western economies. Oh, I'm getting so sleepy. Round 2 for Ike. The election of 1956 was a replay of the 1952 contest, with President Eisenhower pitted once more against Adlai Stevenson. Voters clearly still liked Ike. Eisenhower piled up an enormous majority of 35 million popular votes to Stevenson's 26 million. In the Electoral College, the count was even more unbalanced, 457 to 73. Eisenhower made deeper inroads into the traditional southern bastion of Democratic strength than he had in 1952, but his coattails were not so stiff or broad as in 1952. He failed to win for his party either House of Congress, the first time since Zachary Taylor's election in 1848 that a winning president had headed such a losing ticket. Ike nevertheless bestirred himself when it came to organized labor. Congressional investigations produced scandalous revelations of gangsterism, fraud, and brass-knuckles tactics in many American unions, especially the Teamsters. The AFL-CIO, born of merger of two giants, Oh, my mic fell. Forgot to check it. Congressional investigators, the AFL-CIO, born of a merger of the two giants in 1955, expelled the Teamsters in 1957 for choosing leaders like mob-connected James R. Jimmy Hoffa. Later convicted of jury tampering, Hoffa served part of his sentence before disappearing without a trace, evidently the victim of gangsters he had crossed. To counter such corruption, Eisenhower persuaded Congress to pass the Landrum-Griffin Act in 1959. The act was designed to bring labor leaders to account for financial shenanigans and bullying tactics, but it also expanded some of the anti-labor strictures of the earlier Taft-Hartley Act. Soviet scientists astounded the world on October 4, 1957 by lofting into orbit a beeping 184-pound baby moon, Sputnik. A month later, they launched a 1,120-pound Sputnik 2 with a dog aboard. These amazing breakthroughs rattled American self-confidence. They cast doubts on America's vaunted scientific superiority and raised some sobering military questions. If Soviets could fire heavy objects into outer space, they certainly could reach America with intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Rocket fever swept the nation. Eisenhower established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and directed billions of dollars toward missile development. After humiliating and well-advertised failures, notably the Vanguard missile, which blew up on national television just a few feet above the ground in 1957, in February 1958, the United States managed to put into orbit a grapefruit-sized satellite weighing 2.5 pounds. By the end of the decade, several American satellites had been launched, and the United States had successfully tested its own ICBMs. The Sputnik scare also led to a critical comparison of the American educational system with that of the Soviet Union. In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, to promote research and teaching in science, engineering, and foreign languages. The continuing Cold War. Hold on, let me count how many pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Okay, I'll read these. I'll read the next, 3, and then I'll take a little smidge of a break because my eyeballs hurting. The continuing Cold War. The fantastic race to create weapons of nuclear annihilation continued unabated. Worried scientists urged halting nuclear tests before the atmosphere became so polluted as to produce generations of deformed mutants. The Soviets, after completing an intensive series of exceptionally dirty tests, proclaimed a suspension in March 1958 and urged the Western world to follow. But attempts to regularize suspensions by proper inspection sank on the reef of mutual mistrust. The Boris Khrushchev, meanwhile, demanded in late 1958 that Western powers remove their forces from West Berlin and sought a face-to-face meeting with Eisenhower. Despite grave doubts about any tangible results, the president invited the Soviet leader to America in 1959. Khrushchev appeared before the UN General Assembly before holding an encouraging meeting with Eisenhower at Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland's Catoctin Mountains. Optimism evaporated when a follow-up Paris Summit conference scheduled for May 1960 turned into an embarrassing fiasco. On the eve of the conference, the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane deep in the heart of Russia. After bungling bureaucratic denials in Washington, honest Ike took the unprecedented step of assuming personal responsibility. Khrushchev stormed into Paris feeling the air with incentive, and the conference collapsed before it could get off the ground. The Concord of Camp David was replaced with the Grapes of Wrath. Meanwhile, the Cold War shook America's relations with its hemispheric neighbors. Land Americans bitterly resented Uncle Sam's lavishing of billions of dollars on Europe while doing only millions on its poor relations to the South. They also chafed at Washington's continuing habit of intervening in Latin America's affairs, as in a CIA-directed coup that ousted a leftist government in Guatemala in 1954. At the same time, Washington continued to support, even decorate, bloody dictators who claimed to be combating communists. One such dictator, iron-fisted Fulgencio Batista of Cuba, had encouraged huge investments of American capital, and Washington in turn had given him support. But early in 1959, black-bearded Fidel Castro engineered a revolution that ousted Batista. Castro then denounced the Yankee imperialists and began to expropriate valuable American properties while pursuing a land distribution program. Washington, finally losing patience, released Cuba from imperialistic slavery by cutting off the heavy U.S. imports of Cuban sugar. Castro retaliated with further wholesale confiscations of Yankee property and in effect made his left-wing dictatorship an economic and military satellite of Moscow, to the Kremlin's delighted surprise. An exodus of the anti-Castro Cubans headed for the United States, especially Florida. Nearly 1 million arrived between 1960 and 2000. Washington broke diplomatic relations with Castro's government ready in 1961 and imposed a strict embargo on trade with Cuba, in place to this day. Ooh. Okay. Kennedy challenges Nixon for the presidency. Republicans approached the presidential campaign in 1960 with Vice President Nixon as their heir apparent. But to many, he was a gifted party leader. To others, a ruthless opportunist. The old Nixon had been a no-harms-barred campaigner, adept at skewering Democrats and left-wingers. The new Nixon presented himself as a mature, seasoned statesman. He had gained particular notice in a finger-pointing kitchen debate with Khrushchev in Moscow in 1959, where Nixon extolled the virtues of American consumerism over Soviet economic planning. The next year, he handily won the Republican nomination. On the Democratic side, John F. Kennedy, a youthful millionaire senator from Massachusetts, secured impressive victories in several primary elections, overcoming the reluctance of many party bosses to nominate a Roman Catholic. A disappointed South was not completely appeased when Kennedy's closest rival and the Senate Majority Leader from Texas, Lyndon Barnes Johnson, accepted second place on the ticket in an 11th-hour marriage of convenience. Senator Kennedy was the first Roman Catholic to be nominated for the presidency by either party since Al Smith's three-star campaign in 1928. Smear artists revived the ancient charges about the popes controlling the White House. Kennedy rebutted the attacks and asked if some 40 million Catholic Americans were to be condemned to second-class citizenship from birth. The Protestant Bible Belt South, ordinarily Democratic, had particularly misgivings about the candidate's faith. "I fear Catholicism more than I fear communism," declaimed one Baptist minister in North Carolina. But if many Southern Democrats stayed away from the polls because of Kennedy's Catholicism, Northern Democrats, in unusually large numbers, supported Kennedy because of the bitterest attacks on their Catholic faith. Televisions may well have tipped the scales. Nixon agreed to meet Kennedy in 4 debates. The contestants crossed words in millions of living rooms before the audiences is estimated at 60 million or more. The debates reinforced the importance of image over substance in the television age, as many viewers found Kennedy's glamour and vitality far more appealing than North's tired and pallid appearance. King, who... Wait, did I miss a page? I didn't. King, whose husband, Martin Luther King Jr., was imprisoned in Georgia for a sit-in. Oh, I missed this little paragraph. Kennedy squeezed through with 303 electoral votes to 219, but with a breathtakingly close popular margin of only 118,000 votes out of over 68 million cast. He was not only the first Roman Catholic, but, alas, at 43, the youngest person to date to be elected president. Like Franklin Roosevelt, Kennedy ran well in large industrial centers where he had strong support from workers, Catholics, and African Americans. During the campaign, Kennedy had solicitously telephoned the pregnant Coretta King, whose husband, Martin Luther King Jr., was imprisoned in Georgia for a sit-in. Nixon, eyeing white Southern voters, had declined to comment publicly on the arrest and avoided communication with Mrs. King. The contrast offered an early sign of diverging racial strategies between the two parties. President Eisenhower continued to enjoy extraordinary popularity to the final curtain. Despite Democratic jabs about 18 years of golfing and goofing, Eisenhower was widely admired and respected for decency, goodwill, and moderation. The old soldier let off his warning of the dangers of a burgeoning military-industrial complex, and crestfallen at his failure to end the arms race with the Soviet Union, America grew not only economically under his watch, but geographically as well. Alaska and Hawaii attained statehood in 1959. Okay, I think that's my break. My eye can't be open. Who can't stay open? 1 sec.